Greetings, folks. We'll be reading from the Book of the Sun, which is this book. Now, let me see who's in the chat. Rod James, Zero Coriolis Effect Flat. Greetings. Trolls here? Don't know. Scattered View. Scattered View! Subirat! Okay, folks, I'm thinking of reading from the Book of the Sun, but I think that I might make the screen black, like a vlog. It feels, yeah, in fact, that's what I'm going to do, because sitting here reading it like this, which is what I'm going to do, it just feels a bit grandstandy, you know. Madame Medusa. The website is being done by a pretty cool flat earther. We're going to modernize it. We're gonna work with it soon. There's so many things I need to do. Right, but folks, what I'm gonna do. So now, greetings. I'm just gonna turn the screen black and read, and that way you can do what you're doing at home, or you can visualize, and you won't find my face so distracting. So that's black. Rod James, so you can pick your nose as well. Unfortunately, no, I've got a cold. There's no nose picking to be happening. There's some nose blowing, but I can't have a book cover. I mean, yeah, I could fiddle around and stuff, but I'm not going to. There you go, just black. Thank you very much, Zero Coriolis Effect. Okay, here we go, folks. I'm not going to be looking in the chat because I find him way too distracting. But I hope you enjoy. This is the Book of the Sun, Chapter 6, The Clash of the Suns. Time. One moment leads to the next, progressing continuously onwards, marking changes that lead from one to the next in a nice, neat line. We think in linear time and we experience linear time, and we do this because we live in linear time. From our point of view, based on our experience of life, our conclusions that time is linear are entirely valid. Things start, they change, and they end. Then other things start, and so on, continuously. And we think that because this start, change, and end cycle is so constant, the sun must also be subject to it, having started at some point in time, a point in time that can only be imagined. From that point on, the sun has shined upon whatever its light can reach, and for as long as there has been an earth on which sunlight could shine, sunlight has shined. Modern cosmology says that the sun started first and the earth formed because of this. Without the sun, there would be no earth. This makes earth subservient to the sun, and as important as the sun is, sorry, I've got a cat scratching, is a little bit distracting. Anyway, and as important as the sun is to the earth, this cosmological subservience is only imagined. The cosmological argument is logically sound if we accept the inherent assumptions. Cosmologists are right in arguing that the assumptions themselves are likewise logically sound. But logic breaks down when we assume that if something is logically sound, then it is also true. This is most certainly not the case. Logical arguments can be untrue despite being logically sound, especially in imagined scenarios. For example, my lounge is large enough to fit an adult elephant, and if my lounge window was removed, an elephant could be hoisted up and coast in there. Waking up one day to find an elephant in my lounge would indeed mean that someone had removed the window and hoisted it up there. But to say that because the logic is sound, it means that it has happened is false. It has not happened. I would remember. So, regardless of it all being logically sound, someone could indeed hoist an elephant in and out of my living room. This does not mean that because those things could take place, they did take place. Similarly, if the massive sun started and if it had gravitation, then yes, Earth could be imagined to be formed because of that sun. But in no way does it mean that this did take place. And things only get worse when you start checking the ideas with facts. When you do this, it turns out that the massive gaseous sun idea, as elegant and logically coherent as it might appear, is impossible. And this impossibility translates, in our elephant example, to it being a unicorn that's hoisted up to my lounge instead, which, apart from being impossible, will be even more memorable. When we see that the sun does not illuminate at night, we check ourselves and acknowledge that it does, only it illuminates elsewhere, but that elsewhere is still Earth. We could say the same about the realms illuminated by our consciousness, that the realms of our dreams continue even when our consciousness is illuminating elsewhere, despite having no proof of this. Technology has allowed us to see that the sun does indeed illuminate elsewhere during our night. But in times past, we could only imagine this, as we had no proof. One day, technology will show the same with our dream realms, but that's a subject for another book. In times past, it was impossible to hear someone speaking thousands of miles away, but technology changed that. First, we could hear recordings of voices from distant places. Like we could see recordings of the sun from elsewhere. Now, thanks to technology, we can hear people speak from thousands of miles away, and we can also see the sun while it shines elsewhere. Technology makes possible what was formerly physically impossible, and sometimes we don't even realize what this signifies. It signifies that the ingenious mind can resolve such impossible things through studious observation and investigation, but not through the contemplation of ideas alone. Ideas are tools for the consciousness, but they must be tested. Technology results from the use and the testing of such tools. When consciousness uses ideas to form technology, and the technology goes on to advance the form of ideas available to the consciousness, and this progression continues, just like time. Sorry, that's a bit garbled. But cosmology is based on untested ideas, with observations that appear to support those ideas lauded, while burying all observations that definitively, not just apparently, disprove those ideas. This undignified burial goes on to pollute the collective unconscious, where it festers and eventually emerges as ideas about demons, monsters, zombies, etc. Consciousness properly using the right ideas for studies, investigation and observation of the sun has made it clear that the sun has not always been what it is now, and neither has the earth that it illuminates. Just like our consciousness has not always been what it is now, nor what it illuminates. And while half the ideas were used to test and develop new ways to better observe and determine what is happening and what has happened, the other half were used to determine where and how to disinter evidence of this, which was purposely and ignobly buried. Wow. There was a time when the circling day illuminated a smaller pond thawed out from an endless ice sheet. In that smaller pond there was land and water and flora and fauna, and their day and night chased each other in a circle, with daylight illuminating its day skies. The region where the daylight reached its maximum brightness separated the land into north and south, center north, outer south. There were stars in the night sky turning around a central point when looking towards the north, and stars turning around an illusory central point when looking south. The stars seen when looking up in the north were vaguely reflected in the southern night skies as the stars that encircled there. All these were manifested by and experienced from within an electromagnetic array that was not perceived, and was therefore not understood, for that array did not just manifest these phenomena, but also the consciousness experiencing it. Unbeknownst to the people living in that pond, under that daylight and those nice stars, outside their pond lay another, with a similar but not identical daylight, with stars in its skies too, and with similar flora and fauna. These ponds were separated from each other by leagues upon leagues of non-illuminated ice. The circling daylights themselves resulted as reactions to the energies emanating from the lands over which they turned. In earlier times, when those lands were under ice, the daylight's energies were muted and they were weak. But despite their weakness, because the lands still emitted energy whilst being under ice, those daylights persisted, and their persistence paid, and they became suns. Once the land broke free of their frozen sleep thanks to the sun's warming illumination, the land's energies grew, reaching upwards towards the dim sky, further nourishing the meagre sun, whose illumination thus increased. And as the sun's illumination increased, the thawing of the ice quickened, revealing more lands and redistributing the growing oceans. The flora and fauna that slept underground during the Ice Age emerged and spread, procreating in those lands and oceans, and they flourished under the rays of the nourishing sun, in turn nourishing their sun with their own growing frequencies of energies. And as their numbers grew, their suns grew, and the ponds grew. The combined growth brought forth abundance on the land, an abundance that further nourished the suns, allowing them to extend their reach, and the circle of their ponds widened. Eventually, the reach of the suns met. Each sun was bound to its pond and could not detach from its lands, and there was a clash, the clash of the suns. While locked in this clash, neither sun could continue to illuminate its lands, and to the lands farthest from the region where the suns clashed froze. And so the lands farthest from the regions where the suns clashed froze, driving huge migrations and fauna back underground. This consequential freezing weakened both suns, but it was the largest of the two that suffered the biggest losses, and it had no option but to surrender to the smaller. The smaller, newer sun accepted the defeated sun's surrender and took reign over as much of the vanquished sun's lands as it could without stretching itself too thinly. The joining of the two suns caused the joining of the stars, and new order was brought to the heavens, with the conquering sun now reigning over a much wider circle. Some of its former lands were forsaken, buried in ice, but the newly discovered lands compensated for this. Over the newly defined expanded domain, the new sun's influence grew quickly, made even more powerful by possession of the vanquished sun's energies, its frequencies, and the lion's share of its nourishment. In the newly expanded lands under which the new sun reigned, the people again started to emerge from their subterranean shelters and from their caves. When the flood waters, which came during the clash of suns, started to recede, they went back to their lands, to their towns, and found parts thereof half buried under newly dried mud. They made quick-fix alterations to access the upper floors from the newly elevated ground floor and went back to the business of living. But is any of this true? Yes, and the rest of this book will demonstrate this extensively. Anthropomorphism and apotheosis. This is a subheading. Describing the above without an element of anthropomorphism leaves only two options: describing the process as bacterial or as mechanistic. Atheists would be more tempted to use either of the two rather than accept, just like with the sun shining elsewhere at night, that consciousness also shines elsewhere. But the use of anthropomorphosis for ease of explanation and to avoid misleading bacterial or mechanistic interpretations can cause grave errors. The giving of human qualities to things that do not have such qualities causes misleading superstitious thinking. And superstitions are not questioned by the superstitious. It is not the intention of this author to mislead, so I will clarify here. Archons, demons, devils, and the big baddie, Satan or Lucifer, are literally nothing other than unjustified anthropomorphisms of the fact that bad things happen, that terribly unfortunate, dreadful, tragic, horrendous things happen, and sometimes happen in entirely incoherent and unfathomably horrible ways. And sometimes those things happen because people actively made them happen. But also, incredibly fortunate things happen too, sometimes also because of people's actions, and sometimes even as an unintended and unpredicted consequence of bad actions. When human agency drives events, the superstitious conjure an ineffable anthropomorphized entity, like a Satan or a god. But when no human agent can be determined for either horrible or fortunate thing, we say that it's just life. Apart, of course, from the highly religious, who think that the whole of everything is the result of a combination of decisions made by either gods or demons. The truth is that the whole of it is life. How do we know that this is indeed the case? Because the religious texts that inculcate the former describe a genesis to this world that is false, and by extension the God they claimed as responsible for it. There is no human like Satan and no human like God. There is an ever-existing, perpetual interactive consciousness hub or realm or array or state. This ageless and ultimately supreme ever-existingness doesn't have a name. A name would only be necessary to distinguish it from another, and there is no other to distinguish it from. It has no interest whatsoever in being glorified and exalted, and even less worshipped. Those are all qualities of fabricated gods, or better said, claims made about gods by charlatans who say that they are working for the real thing. These are charlatans who claim to know what those fabricated gods want and do not want, which, incidentally, usually means that those fabricated gods want their representatives to be adulated. Something imperative to avoid when seeking to understand more clearly Something more imperative to avoid when seeking to understand more clearly is anthropomorphizing, a tendency we inherited from the Christian torturers. When we do, we define by qualities that are not present, like reproductive organs, and the labels we use to name it prescribe unjustified limits to the ineffable. Every religion in the world is guilty of abusing ineffableness over the innocent and naive, guilty of giving it a name, and guilty of calling it theirs. If you want to detect the ignoramus, wait for them to tell you the name of their god. If they name it, then you know they haven't a clue what they are talking about, and the reason they don't know better is because they have been cowed by superstition. In short, when we define the ineffable, we give it qualities that it does not have and bind ourselves to those definitions with boundaries that restrict our ability to gain better understanding. The very same thing happens with the sun. When we give it form and function, we define it, and it's important that we do not do so in error. Once defined, the superstitious are too timid to veer from those definitions. The best we can hope for, then, is to describe it accurately, and thus help develop tools for those brave enough to attempt to understand it better. Because the sun is inextricably associated with the exchange of energies, rather than give it human qualities or turn it into a god, we can instead compare it with something that's also inextricably associated with exchange of energies, like the AC generator and the electrical circuit. With electrical circuits, we have lines or channels along which electrical current flows to things that use it. With the AC generator, we have rotating magnetism generating electrical energy, which can then go on to transmit energy or information to electrical devices through circuits. The sun is light, while the generator and the circuit are physical. Magnetism can directly translate into light without an electrical circuit by energizing noble gases, which are physical. Ionizing radiation does the same, but both magnetism and ionizing radiation cause light by energizing a circuit that we do not see, a circuit inherent in the noble gases, or to the noble gases. This unseen circuit we can refer to as an array formerly known as the ether. A physical electrical circuit must be closed for the current to flow. A non-physical or unseen circuit, like that of the sun, needs the same for the sun to be seen. When the sun is seen, it is because there is a direct, closed circuit entangling the sun and the eye of the observer, and when that circuit is interrupted, the sun is no longer visible. We consider shadows simplistically as the result of sunlight being occluded from the area in shadow. But in reality, shadows show the interruption of the circuit of the sun. In other words, the sun is a feedback loop of information transmitting energy. Where the loop is interrupted, the sun is no longer visible. Same as electricity in a circuit. When the circuit is interrupted, the electricity can no longer flow. The sun's circuit has reciprocity. Where it energizes with light, the reciprocal result is heat, growth, or change of form, like from ice to water, from night to day, etc. This change is not a side effect of the sun spreading out its light, as is taught in schools and universities. It is change caused by the fact that, just as the AC generator produces electricity in a form that can transmit energy or information, the sun does likewise. It transmits energy and information. That's one of the inherent qualities of light itself, the transmission of information. What the sun really is, what causes it, or what is it the result of, will be described at length in later chapters. We can rest assured that the sun is not in any way a gaseous mass emitting light, and this fact, although brushed under the carpet by superstitious astronomers and astrophysicists alike, puts an end to the stars as distant gaseous masses emitting light too, along with the gaseous planets. So, what are the celestial poles and the stars found therein? They are two sides of the same coin, with one side called positive and the other called negative, or one called south and the other north. What cannot exist without a positive and a negative, a south and a north? Magnetism and life. The blackness of space, another subheading. When we look up into the night sky, marveling at the stars, nebulas, the Milky Way, wandering star planets, expected and unexpected comets, and even meteor showers, we marvel thanks to the blackness of space offering sufficient contrast. But this blackness itself, which received wisdom says is simply absence of light, and the inane think is seeing into infinity, turns out to emit very high frequency non-ionizing radiation, much higher than the frequency of visible light. These very high levels of radiation are believed by cosmologists to be coming from what are referred to as the Van Allen radiation belts. And as we saw recently, I'm editorializing, from the beginning of the Big Bang and all that nonsense. A more descriptive name would be Van Allen radiation onion. But that makes it sound a bit absurd, and cosmologists have a dreadful fear of being found absurd. Regardless, this radiation is referred to as belts because they appear to be layered in bands. Fluids at different temperatures or of varying densities will also layer in bands. So, what could be black? Layered like fluids with layered levels of radiation and float above the Earth as if held aloft by something like, oh, I don't know, water's repulsion to magnetism? Liquid electricity, that's what. We know that energy, the big E in Einstein's vapid E equals mc squared, can be considered to change forms. But we've never stopped to think what forms electricity, which is an energy, could take. We know we can store electricity in fluids and in other materials used in batteries or fuel cells, but we know it can change gases, converting them to plasmas, but we've never really considered electricity itself as a raw energy that can literally change forms. But electricity is a raw energy, and therefore it can change forms. And I put it to you that not only can it take the form of a black liquid, I say that it does, and that this is what the blackness of space is. Moreover, I say that this will be found to be the case by physicists. Are there already any indicators that this liquid electricity idea might turn out to be true? Perhaps. If it turns out that such high levels of radiation as are found in the Van Allen belts cannot exist without themselves causing light in the visible range, a very probable case considering the temperature of the assumed charged particles, then it could easily turn out that the reason the charge is so high despite the blackness in the visible light spectrum is because the blackness itself is what's emanating the radiation without involving any particles. The charged particles are, after all, theorized out of necessity. Time will tell, but now back to the Sun. There have been many theories of the movement of the celestial bodies developed over time, and as long as the theories matched the observable behavior, all was fine. But the jarring mismatch between the theory of rotundity of the spherical Earth and the observable lack of gyroscopic apparent drift means that all the theories based on both a spherical stationary Earth, as geocentric, and the rotating Earth, the current prevailing official theory, are wrong. And with that goes the idea of a tangible sun. The current philosophy behind the theory of a spherical Earth and the models derived thereof, with a scientifically demonstrable false fiery mass at some distance from the Earth, posits the idea of the Sun dying at some point in the future. The predictions as to when this might occur are as varied as there are programs of funding grants for them. Because observations of the stars are claimed to have shown the stars stop existing, or better said, stop transmitting light in the same type as before, and those stars are believed to be the same kind of thing as our Sun, the same type of death is expected. Fortunately for organisms seeking grounds on which to appeal for organizations. Fortunately for organizations seeking grounds on which to appeal for funding, this theory also posits a high probability of there being Earth-like planets around stars much like Sol, except younger, on which the human races might flourish. Science fiction writers, shamelessly acknowledged by astrophysicists as their greatest source of inspiration, have created stories about precisely that, populating other planets in other solar systems, where solar means orbiting a central star. But this idea is entirely based on inductive reasoning that goes like this. The Sun is a star, Sol. There are planets near this star, made and maintained in orbit by the gravitational pull of Sol. There are other stars out there just like Sol. These must have similar gravitational fields, so there are probably planets near those too, for identical reasons as our solar systems. So, to go live on those other planets, all we must do is find them and travel to them. That's generally the underlying narrative. For these stories to be considered plausible, the whole thing must first be believed as being possible. The key term here is belief. Those who planted the seeds of the narrative describing all of this were expert planters of narratives. They had an insidious ability to make people believe the most blatantly false stories. filled with all manner of inconsistencies and impossibilities. And they didn't just have words with which to mould perceptions of reality, they also had the best rewards for those who played along with the narrative, as well as the most excruciatingly monstrous torture devices imaginable, literally, along with the will to use them on those who displayed lack of belief in the narrative that was being presented. Who was this? The Roman Catholic Church at the height of its power, when it was the most draconian institution to have ever existed in our world, standing high above all other empires in scope for violence and cunning manipulation, outdoing even King Ashurbanipal's vicious Assyrian Empire. It was the Catholic Church that created the Copernican model of the universe, trimmed and updated as necessary. Copernicus was, after all, a priest. True, he did not hold Mass and lead congregations, but not all priests hold Mass. He is, however, listed as a priest in the Vatican's ledgers and was protected by the Vatican, just like all other Catholic priests. And the globe theory was developed at the height of the Catholic Inquisition's bloody persecution and murder of influential women, who they called witches, along with anyone who did not play along or were believers of anything other than the Catholic narrative. Because of the shame such hideous murders have brought the Church, what is now taught by the Church is that witches were drowned, some may be burned to death. But they say this because everyone knows they burned Joan of Arc after she dedicated her life to defending the Catholic Church. How ungrateful. But it's okay, they later made her a saint, so that makes it all fine. This drowning and burning narrative give a false impression because the truth is that some of the women were literally torn apart from the inside with the pear, a spiked, pear-shaped contraption which was forced into the vagina of disbelieving women and young girls and was then cranked open until they died. Imagine the screams and the clergy relishing this as signs that the devil was being thwarted in the name of Jesus Christ. Anyone who tried to defend these women and children would also be tortured to death in any manner of ways, with all kinds of horrible devices personally designed by the sitting popes. And they also burned heretics, other non-believers, to death. It was literally against the law to not believe what the Church taught. And what the Church taught after 300 years of such trauma conditioning is that the earth is a sphere. To support Copernicus's construct, the fact that thinkers throughout time have pondered what this world is and how it came to be, what the sun and the other celestial bodies are, and how it all works, was used by the Church, which would literally ransack and take whatever it wanted from the cultures its puppet armies invaded. Anything that could be used to support their ideas was used, and what could not was either destroyed or hidden in the vaults of the Vatican. And anything considered necessary to support the narrative which did not exist was simply forged, like fragments of the crucifixion cross. Forgeries would also come in the form of maps, like the Piri Reis, documents like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and other fabrications. The Vatican was, as it is today, the greatest forger and convincer. Remember the Shroud of Turin? It turns out that it's not the burial shroud of the temporary corpse of God-made flesh after all. And the first to expose this fraud as a forgery was a bishop. Not all the clergy are as corrupt as the worst. When it comes to evidence supporting progressive ideas about the earth being a sphere, all we have is hearsay and forgeries, and sometimes only hearsay. The story of Eratosthenes being just such. It's imperative to bear this in mind. In the West, all the official stories about the past that are presented to us have been approved by the Vatican. If the Vatican wants to hide a truth, it will hide the truth. See the 2015 movie Spotlight. One way to tell whether a story is true is if the details remain constant. Of course, consistent story details do not ipso facto prove a truth, but lack of consistency does indicate falsehood. With the story of Eratosthenes, The inconsistencies vary wildly. There is no excuse for this. If the story resulted from a discovered original written version, there would be no changing of critical details. But if the story was invented, then yes, the details can change because it cannot be verifiably corrected. As long as what is told contains the general gist of the idea, that'll do for the traumatized, easily frightened masses. So, the story is that Eratosthenes, I'm going to say it correctly by the way. So the story is that Eratosthenes was the librarian of the fabled Library of Alexandria in Egypt, then part of the Greek Empire. This library was a repository of great knowledge. Unfortunately, as the story goes, it was accidentally burned down by Julius Caesar's army some 200 years later, and the most valuable books burned, not secretly taken to ancient Rome, which is where the Vatican now stands, or anything like that. Surely, why would someone like Julius Caesar want knowledge? What has knowledge ever done for anyone? At the height of the Greek Empire, some 200 years before, some 200 years before it was burned, or part burned, or singed, records of this, which might also be forgeries or at the very least edited to suit a narrative, directly contradict one another. Eratosthenes, while being the librarian, was also a cartographer, geometrician. All educated Greeks were geometricians. This is part of how they processed the world. And, despite there being apparently no records of his philosophies, a philosopher. He is sometimes accredited as having founded geography. Despite the Jawa Dam having been built in Jordan some 3,000 years earlier, and the Chinese having dams in their very creation myths, but never mind those as proof of use of geography. Eratosthenes, being the father of geography, is convenient because he is taught to the masses as being the guy who figured out that the Earth was a sphere using the Greek version of the protractor, the scapha, which separated the circle into 60 parts, not 360. The Babylonians and later Macedonians, who were flat earthers, depicted the heavens as a planisphere, a flat circle, but conceptualized it as a cylindrical projection, making the most accurately predictive model ever, even to this day. Their system includes the Saros cycle, still in use today by NASA subcontractors to predict eclipses, without which they could not be accurately predicted. The 360-degree protractor wasn't introduced to the Greeks until some 60 years after the death of Eratosthenes. And as chance would have it, 360 degrees divided into 60 sections makes 6 degrees per section, the Greek scapha. Too crude and imprecise a tool to show the supposed 7.2 degrees allegedly observed by Eratosthenes. Eratosthenes was referred to by his contemporaries as beta, a mocking term indicating that he was not alpha in any of his pursuits. And although he was similarly interested as those, although he had similar interests as those of Pythagoras, 300 years his predecessor, he, unlike Pythagoras, was mediocre in all of them. The fact that he was not bright enough to figure out that instead of waiting for a specific day of the year to take note of a shadow's angle at solar noon in Alexandria to compare it with the previous year's angle on the same day in Syene, he could have instead done it all from Alexandria on that very same day. By instructing an emissary on how to proceed and sending him to a location in Arachosia, 2,000 miles east of Alexandria, instead of doing this comparison with a mere 500 miles southeast to Syene, he could have also included Arachosia's simultaneous shadow 2,000 miles away in the easternmost reaches of the Greek Empire, employing mirrors to communicate back and forth, which, apart from deriving much better data, would have been a spectacular event, highlighting the glory and ingenuity of the Greek Empire and the genius of Eratosthenes. But no, instead of coordination, fanfare and glory, it was a furtive, skulking affair. And the Greeks have a very bad history with furtive, skulking behaviours, like with the Battle of Thermopylae, better known as the Battle of 300 Spartans versus a Persian army of Xerxes the Great. And this furtiveness continues to this day in the telling of the story itself, with stories ranging from Eratosthenes looking at two shadows separated by 500 miles on the same day, the version for the stupid, to him looking at one shadow, having taken note of the other the previous year, to these shadows being cast by sticks, columns, a combination of sticks and columns, and a shadow on a wall, or reflection in a well, with him paying someone to pace out the distance instead of just looking at the town records that the Greeks, whose territories were measured using geometric principles inherited from Xerxes, kept, lo and behold, in the Motion, the predecessor to the university, on whose very grounds stood the library at which Eratosthenes worked. Eratosthenes could have literally just walked across the square and looked at the records to see exactly how far Syene was from Alexandria. Incidentally, Xerxes, the king of kings, had established an efficient messenger service, a postal service as it were, throughout the entirety of his empire's territory 300 years earlier, the same territory that became the Greek Empire in which Eratosthenes lived. So Eratosthenes could have just asked the local postman. The importance of a popular theory is not in the details. Most people don't know the details, but still believe the theory. Its importance is in the perception molding aspects of the theory. How much sense can people make of it? Can people imagine it through visualization? Everyone can visualize blackness and a sudden bright flash, the Big Bang, and everyone can visualize things changing over time, evolution. That's why those theories persist despite their impossibilities. They are made facile for facile minds to grasp. It helps if people are made ignorant of what makes an impossibility impossible, like seeing the sun reflected in the bottom of a well when the truth is, if it's seen it's 90 degrees above your head, the best you'll see is your own head in that reflection blocking out the sun. It is literally impossible to see the sun at the bottom of a well when it is 90 degrees above your head. No amount of moving your head from side to side or back and forth, trying to sneak a peek or even look very quickly will stop the parallax effect from keeping the sun behind your head's reflection. But teaching people the story will cause them to imagine seeing a bright sun reflected on water at the bottom of a well without considering the angles involved and how reality works. And this kind of trick breeds people who don't know what impossible means, and those people can be persuaded to believe literally anything, no matter how easily those beliefs might be dispelled, perfectly groomed for manipulation. I'll read one more paragraph and I'll quit. Legitimate theories are also limited by the scope of understanding available to both those who are developing the theories and those who are keen to understand them. And the scope is further limited by language itself. If some new thing is discovered or conceived of for which there is no word, either an entirely new word must be formed or an old one borrowed and altered to encompass the definition of the new thing. Otherwise it cannot be addressed, expressed, or even properly grasped. And what can be grasped is always an extension of what has formerly been perceived, experienced, or expressed, which is why new words tend to grow from old root words. Consequently, our understanding also grows from old root understandings extended to encompass new things. Although this extension is naturally natural and generally justifiable, it can also blind us from truer alternatives and better understanding by binding us to erroneous old misconceptions through the old meaning of the very words used to describe new things. This is only worsened by false theories that are accepted as true because those theories mold the minds of those who believe them, as well as molding the language through which to express them. Ecliptic and parabolic are two such words. Ecliptic was created by borrowing the same root word used for eclipse, failing to appear or to leave, because both the sun and moon eclipse and eclipses happen in cycles that coincide with where these celestial bodies appear to be in relation to each other, a circuit that brings them into eclipse was derived, and to describe this circuit, the word ecliptic was created. That's justifiable, although utterly wrong. Similarly, parabolic has the same root as parable, being a story that explains something through implicit similes in a side-by-side interpretation. This means such, and that means therefore, and so on. The same technique is used in what's referred to as fairy tales and folk stories, but the borrowing of one word to make another or attributing a new meaning to an existing word distorts the intended meaning of the word and the new interpretation. The word body, for instance, has a pretty simple meaning, but when used alongside a term like of work or of influence or even of proof, that meaning starts to dissolve and become much more nebulous and intangible, which is the opposite of any language's purpose. It distorts the meaning, making it vague and almost entirely arbitrary. In the English language, to disguise this devaluing modification of a word's meaning, a foreign word of the same meaning is sometimes used, such as the French word for body, corps, as in corps of infantry. In some cases, the word's placement is interchangeable, coming before or after the modifying term, like corps of infantry and infantry corps. The word men or soldiers could be used, but the military is the most abusive with this misuse of words. After all, they do use the word unit for what is really either a man, a woman, or child, or a group thereof, and infantry, which literally means to make into children, to describe frontline troops. The history of this word is deplorable. The devaluing of the meaning of a word when it precedes a term is reversed when it follows a term, where the indistinct nebulousness that diffuses the meaning in the former instead conjures an element of concreteness in the latter. Terms like governing body and administrative body evoke a corporeal quality to something that is decidedly incorporeal, as shown with the paradoxical term astral body. These uses of the word body are unjustified, given that there are perfectly justifiable and more exact alternatives like agency, organization, or even group, and for the more ethereal astral body, projection serves perfectly well. With this in mind, let's now examine the term celestial body. But instead, that's where I'll quit. Thank you very much, folk. I don't know how many of you are listening. Oh, there you are. Oh, tired. Let me see where things are. There. Okay, folks. That was part of chapter 6 of the Book of the Sun. I hope you enjoyed. Now I'm bailing and I'm going for a well-earned rest. Thank you very much, everybody. Ciao. Oh, wait. Before I go, what's the point? What's the point of developing a theory or positing a model? What's the point? The point is this. The reason the model of the globe was invented was that people have an inherent need to know where they are. The globelings think they know where they are on that model. The model's false. We know this. They can't see themselves where they really are. Flat earthers can't really see themselves where they really are, so they turn to religion for comfort. If you can create a story that is understandable and makes sense, and you can see reflected in the real world, or at least echoed in history, then you've given people a foothold where they can then develop their own ideas and ways of interpreting reality. That's why. Okay, thanks everyone.